Margaret Maggie Sullivan was 26 years old when she began excavating a bedroom directly into the hillside behind her Nebraska Territory cabin in August of 1875, and every neighbor who passed by her homestead thought she had lost her mind. "She's digging a cave into the dirt like some kind of animal," they would say to each other with a mixture of concern and mockery. "Building a bedroom underground instead of adding onto her perfectly good cabin. The poor woman must be touched in the head from living alone out here." By February of 1876, those same neighbors were standing inside Maggie's dugout bedroom in complete amazement, feeling the comfortable 50-degree warmth radiating from the earth walls, while their own conventional bedrooms back home were struggling to maintain 30 degrees despite burning cord after cord of precious firewood through the brutal Nebraska winter. Maggie had arrived in the Nebraska Territory in the spring of 1873 with her husband Thomas, and together they had built a modest but sturdy cabin on their quarter-section claim near the settlement of Grand Island. Thomas had been a skilled carpenter back in Pennsylvania, and he had taught Maggie everything he knew about construction and frontier survival during their first 2 years on the claim. Thomas died in March of 1875 from pneumonia after working in wet conditions during an early spring storm. His death left Maggie widowed at 26 with a paid-off homestead, a solid cabin, and most importantly, all of the practical skills that Thomas had insisted she learn. "You need to know everything that I know," he had told her countless times. "The frontier doesn't care whether you're a man or a woman. It only cares whether you're competent and prepared." After Thomas's death, Maggie continued working the homestead on her own, proving to herself and to the skeptical neighbors that a woman could indeed survive and even thrive alone on the Nebraska prairie. But during her first winter alone in 1874 to 75, she had noticed a fundamental problem with conventional cabin construction that had been nagging at her throughout the cold months. The cabin that she and Thomas had built was typical frontier construction. 8-inch pine logs stacked horizontally with moss and clay chinking between them, a steep gable roof covered with wooden shakes, and a single cast-iron stove in the main living area for heating. The cabin had a sleeping loft accessed by a ladder, where the bedroom area was located up under the peaked roof. During the winter, Maggie had discovered that the sleeping loft was miserably cold at night, even when she kept the stove burning continuously downstairs. The problem was simple physics that she hadn't fully understood until she experienced it firsthand. Heat rises, yes, but it also escapes rapidly through any surface that isn't properly insulated. The loft was positioned right up against the roof, which had minimal insulation. Heat from the stove below would rise through the cabin, reach the loft, and then immediately conduct through the thin roof boards and escape into the cold night air outside. She would go to bed each night, wearing every piece of clothing she owned, wrapped in multiple quilts and blankets, and still wake up shivering in the early morning hours when the stove downstairs had burned down to coals. The bedroom was always the coldest part of the cabin, despite being the place where warmth was most needed during the vulnerable sleeping hours. Maggie had spent much of that first winter alone, thinking about Thomas's lessons on thermal dynamics and earth construction. He had pointed out dugout homes during their journey west, explaining how pioneers who couldn't afford lumber would dig directly into hillsides, creating homes that were naturally insulated by the surrounding earth. "The earth is a remarkable insulator," Thomas had explained. "Once you get a few feet below the surface, the temperature stays relatively constant year-round, somewhere around 50 degrees in this region. A properly built dugout stays cool in summer and warm in winter with minimal heating or cooling needed." At the time, Maggie had dismissed dugouts as crude emergency shelters for people who couldn't afford proper construction. But after suffering through that first winter alone in her cold sleeping loft, an idea began to form in her mind. What if she could combine the best of both approaches? Keep the main cabin for living space, but create a separate bedroom dug directly into the hillside where the Earth's natural thermal mass would maintain a comfortable sleeping temperature without requiring any additional heating at all. The more she thought about it, the more the idea made perfect sense. The hillside behind her cabin was a perfect candidate: stable clay soil, good drainage, southern exposure for the entrance. She could excavate a bedroom-sized chamber, finish it properly with timber supports and a solid door, and create a sleeping space that would stay naturally warm all winter long without burning a single stick of firewood. In early August of 1875, Maggie began the excavation project. She started by carefully selecting the location on the hillside, about 30 feet behind her cabin. She wanted a spot where the soil was stable, where natural drainage would carry water away from the chamber rather than into it, and where the entrance would face south to capture whatever passive solar heat was available during the winter days. She marked out the dimensions of the chamber she wanted to create: 10 feet wide, 12 feet deep, and 8 feet high at the center. This would give her a bedroom space of approximately 120 square feet, more than adequate for a single sleeping area, and small enough that her own body heat would help maintain the temperature during the night. The excavation process was brutal physical labor that took 6 weeks of steady work. Maggie would rise at dawn each day and spend the entire morning digging into the hillside with a pickaxe and shovel. The Nebraska clay soil was dense and heavy, requiring her to first loosen it with the pick before she could shovel it into a wheelbarrow and haul it away. She worked systematically, starting at the hillside face and digging horizontally into the earth. The first few feet were relatively easy, as she was simply cutting into the exposed hillside. But as she penetrated deeper, the work became more challenging. She had to remove all of the excavated soil by wheelbarrow, hauling it down the slope and spreading it around her property. By the end of the first week, she had created a horizontal tunnel about 4 feet deep into the hillside. By the end of the second week, she had reached 6 feet. The work was exhausting, but Maggie was sustained by her vision of what this space would become: a bedroom where she could sleep in natural warmth all winter long. As she dug deeper, Maggie had to begin installing timber supports to prevent cave-ins. She used heavy posts salvaged from Thomas's collection of building materials, setting vertical supports every 4 feet along the walls and installing horizontal beams across the top to support the earth ceiling. These timber frames would bear the weight of the soil above and prevent any collapses. By early September, she had excavated the full 12-foot depth of the chamber. Now came the work of shaping the space and making it livable. She carefully carved the ceiling into a gentle arch rather than leaving it flat. Thomas had taught her that an arched ceiling distributes the weight of the earth above more evenly, making the structure more stable and less likely to collapse. She smoothed the walls as much as possible with hand tools, creating relatively flat surfaces. The floor she excavated slightly deeper than she needed, then filled it back in with crushed gravel for drainage, topped with smooth, flat stones that she had gathered from a nearby creek. This created a solid, dry floor that would never turn muddy even if some water did seep in. The entrance was the most critical element of the entire project. Maggie built a proper door frame using heavy timbers, setting it into the hillside opening with careful measurements to ensure it was perfectly plumb and square. The door itself she constructed from 2-inch thick oak planks bolted together horizontally, creating a solid barrier that would seal the chamber against drafts and weather. She hung the door on heavy iron strap hinges salvaged from an old barn door, positioning it to swing outward so that snow accumulation in the winter wouldn't block it shut. Around the door frame, she carefully packed clay and stones to create a weatherproof seal between the timber and the surrounding earth. For ventilation, Maggie cut a small shaft upward from the back of the chamber, angling it to emerge from the hillside about 10 feet above the entrance. She lined this shaft with stones to prevent collapse and covered the top opening with a stone cap that allowed air to flow but kept rain and snow out. This ventilation shaft would prevent carbon dioxide buildup and allow fresh air circulation without creating drafts that would cool the space. Inside the chamber, she built a simple but sturdy bed frame using wooden poles lashed together with a rope lattice to support a straw mattress. She added a small shelf carved into the earth wall for a candle lantern and hung wooden pegs driven into the support beams for hanging clothes. By late September, the dugout bedroom was complete. From the outside, only the heavy wooden door set into the hillside revealed that this was a human-made structure rather than a natural feature of the landscape. The entrance was framed with timber and the door was stained with linseed oil to protect it from the weather, but otherwise the chamber was completely underground and invisible from any distance. When Maggie's neighbors first learned about what she was building, the reactions ranged from puzzlement to open mockery. Anna Fletcher, who lived on the neighboring homestead, visited in early September while the excavation was still in progress. "Maggie, what on earth are you doing back here?" Anna asked, watching Maggie emerge from the hillside tunnel covered in dirt and clay. "Are you digging a root cellar?" "No, it's going to be my bedroom," Maggie replied, wiping sweat from her forehead. "I'm tired of freezing in the cabin loft all winter. This space will stay naturally warm from the earth's heat." Anna looked at her with genuine concern. "You're planning to sleep in a dirt cave? Maggie, that's not healthy. It'll be damp and moldy. You'll catch your death living underground like that. Why don't you just build a proper room addition onto your cabin?" "Because a room addition would be just as cold as the loft," Maggie explained patiently. "Any above-ground structure loses heat through the walls and roof. But underground, the earth maintains a constant temperature of around 50 degrees year-round. I won't need any heat at all. The earth itself will keep the space warm." Anna shook her head. "That may be true for a root cellar, but sleeping in one is different. People aren't meant to live underground. It's unnatural. I really think you should reconsider this." But Maggie had made up her mind, and she continued with the project despite the growing concern and criticism from her neighbors. George Peterson, who owned land to the south, stopped by in mid-September with an even harsher assessment. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've been hearing about your cave project," he said bluntly. "People are worried about you. Building a bedroom in the dirt, living like a prairie dog, it's not normal behavior. Some folks are starting to wonder if the loneliness out here is affecting your judgment. Have you thought about moving back east, where you'd have family to help you?" Maggie felt her temper rise, but kept her voice level. "Mr. Peterson, I appreciate your concern, but my judgment is perfectly sound. I'm applying basic principles of thermal dynamics that my late husband taught me. The earth is an excellent insulator, and this bedroom will be far more comfortable than any above-ground structure could be. I'm not being crazy, I'm being practical." Peterson shook his head and rode away, clearly unconvinced. Over the following weeks, Maggie heard through the small community gossip network that her insane cave bedroom had become a popular topic of conversation. Some people expressed genuine concern about her mental state. Others simply mocked the idea as foolish eccentricity. A few of the more superstitious folks even suggested that living underground was somehow sinful or against God's intentions for human habitation. But Maggie pressed on with her project, sustained by her confidence in the principles Thomas had taught her. She knew the science was sound, even if her neighbors couldn't understand it. In early October, she moved her sleeping arrangements from the cabin loft down to the dugout bedroom. The first night in her new underground sleeping chamber was a revelation. Even though the weather outside was still relatively mild in early fall, she could immediately feel the difference in temperature. The dugout maintained a stable, comfortable temperature that felt like a warm spring day, somewhere in the low 50s. She lay down on her straw mattress that first night, wearing just a simple nightgown and covered with a single light quilt, far less bedding than she had needed in the frigid cabin loft. The air in the chamber was dry and clean-smelling, with no trace of the dampness or mustiness that her neighbors had warned about. The ventilation shaft was working perfectly, providing fresh air without creating any uncomfortable drafts. As she drifted off to sleep that first night, Maggie felt genuinely warm and comfortable for the first time in months, and she hadn't burned a single piece of firewood to achieve it. November brought the first cold weather, with temperatures dropping into the 20s at night. In the cabin, Maggie kept the stove burning during the day for cooking and warmth while she worked on her indoor tasks. But at night, she would let the fire burn down to nothing, knowing that she wouldn't need it in her dugout bedroom. Each evening around sunset, she would take her candle lantern and walk the 30 feet from the cabin to the hillside door. She would open the heavy oak door and step into her underground chamber, where the temperature remained a steady 50 degrees, regardless of the freezing conditions outside. The contrast was remarkable. She would leave the cold cabin wearing a heavy shawl, walk through the freezing night air, and enter the dugout bedroom to be greeted by comfortable warmth. It felt like stepping into a different season, from winter outside to perpetual spring inside. December brought the first real test of the dugout's performance, with temperatures plunging to 0 and below. Throughout the settlement, families were burning through their firewood supplies at an alarming rate, stoking their stoves day and night to keep their homes barely habitable. The cost of staying warm was measured not just in labor and money, but in the constant anxiety about whether their wood supplies would last through the winter. Anna Fletcher stopped by Maggie's cabin in mid-December, and Maggie invited her in for coffee. As they sat by the warm stove in the main cabin, Anna couldn't help but notice the nearly full woodpile outside through the window. "Maggie, you haven't used much wood this winter," Anna observed. "How are you keeping warm? Your cabin is comfortable now, but surely you're burning through fuel at night." "Actually, I let the fire die out completely each night," Maggie replied with a slight smile. "I don't need it. The dugout bedroom stays warm on its own." Anna looked skeptical. "You're really sleeping in that cave every night? Even in this cold? How is that even possible?" "Come with me," Maggie said, setting down her coffee cup. "Let me show you." They bundled up in heavy coats and walked outside into the bitter December afternoon. The temperature was probably around 10 degrees, with a sharp wind that cut through their layers. They walked across the frozen ground to the hillside, and Maggie opened the heavy wooden door. As soon as the door swung open, Anna felt the wave of warm air flowing out from the chamber. They stepped inside, and Maggie pulled the door closed behind them. She lit the candle lantern on the shelf, and the small flame cast a warm glow around the underground room. Anna stood there in stunned silence, her mouth hanging open in astonishment. The chamber was genuinely warm. Not just less cold, but actually comfortably warm. She pulled off her heavy mittens and held her bare hands out, feeling the ambient warmth in the air. The temperature had to be at least 50 degrees, maybe even 55. "This is incredible," Anna finally managed to say. "It feels like early spring in here. How is this possible?" Maggie explained the basic principle. The earth itself is maintaining this temperature. A few feet below the surface, the soil stays at a constant temperature year-round, around 50 degrees in this region. That's because the massive thermal mass of the earth resists temperature changes. All I had to do was dig deep enough to access that stable temperature zone. Anna walked around the small chamber, touching the earth walls and feeling the consistent warmth radiating from them. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I thought you were crazy to build this. I told George you'd be miserable and sick from living in a damp cave. But this is warmer than my own bedroom back home, even with the stove running all night. And it's completely dry." "The ventilation is key to keeping it dry," Maggie explained, pointing to the shaft opening at the back of the chamber. Fresh air circulates through constantly, carrying away any moisture before it can accumulate. Anna sat down on the edge of the bed, still marveling at the comfortable temperature. "Do you know what this means, Maggie? You're sleeping warm every night without burning any firewood at all. My family's going through nearly a cord a week trying to keep our bedroom even marginally habitable. At this rate, we're going to run out of wood before spring." Word of the heated conversation spread quickly through the small settlement. Within days, other neighbors started asking if they could visit Maggie's dugout bedroom to see this phenomenon for themselves. Some came out of genuine curiosity, while others came half expecting to discover that the stories were exaggerated. George Peterson visited with his wife Martha on a particularly cold day in late December when the temperature had dropped to -5 degrees. Maggie gave them the same demonstration she had given Anna, leading them from the frigid winter air outside into the warm underground chamber. Peterson stood there shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't understand," he said, removing his heavy coat in the comfortable warmth. "There's no stove, no fire, nothing burning. Where is the heat coming from?" "The earth," Maggie explained again. "The soil around this chamber is all at approximately 50 degrees. It's like being surrounded by a massive warm water battery that never runs out." Martha Peterson had tears in her eyes. "Our bedroom at home is so cold that ice forms on the inside of the windows," she said. "We sleep wearing every stitch of clothing we own, under 5 quilts, and we still wake up shivering. And here you are, sleeping in comfortable warmth, using no fuel at all." "The initial work was hard," Maggie admitted. 6 weeks of digging is no small task. But now that it's built, it requires no maintenance and no fuel, just a warm place to sleep every single night, for as long as the earth exists. By January of 1876, Maggie's dugout bedroom had become something of a local attraction. People would ride for miles to see the woman who slept warm without fire. Some came seeking advice on building their own versions. Others came simply out of scientific curiosity about this practical application of geothermal principles. Thomas Whitfield, a farmer from a neighboring county, arrived in mid-January with detailed questions about the construction process. "I want to build one for my family," he explained. "We have 5 children, and keeping them warm at night is costing us everything. If what I've heard is true, if this really works as well as people say, then I need to build something similar." Maggie spent 2 hours with Whitfield, explaining every detail of the construction. She showed him how to select the proper location, how deep to excavate, how to install the support timbers, how to build the ventilation shaft, how to seal the entrance. She even drew sketches on paper to illustrate the key principles. "The most important thing to understand," she emphasized, "is that you need to dig deep enough to reach the stable temperature zone, at least 8 feet of earth above your ceiling. That's what provides the thermal mass that maintains the constant temperature." Over the course of that winter, 7 families in the surrounding area built their own versions of Maggie's dugout bedroom, following her instructions and adapting the design to their particular situations. Some built single sleeping chambers like Maggie's. Others created larger spaces with room for multiple beds. One family even excavated an entire underground wing onto their existing cabin, creating 3 connected dugout bedrooms. The results were universally successful. Every family reported the same experience: comfortable sleeping warmth maintained naturally by the earth, with no fuel cost and no ongoing labor required. The contrast with conventional heated bedrooms was stark and undeniable. By the end of February, when the worst of the winter cold had passed, the community's attitude toward Maggie had completely reversed. The woman who had been mocked for her insane cave just months earlier was now being praised as an innovative problem solver who had found a practical solution to one of frontier life's most difficult challenges, staying warm through a brutal winter with limited fuel resources. The local newspaper sent a correspondent to interview Maggie and document her dugout bedroom. The resulting article, published in March of 1876, was titled "Underground Innovation: Nebraska Woman Sleeps Warm Without Fuel." The article explained the basic principles of earth-sheltered construction and predicted that this approach might become more common as settlers sought ways to reduce their dependence on scarce and expensive firewood. Maggie lived on her homestead for another 30 years, eventually remarrying in 1881 to a widower named Eric Larson, who admired both her practical skills and her willingness to think independently. Together, they expanded the dugout concept, eventually creating an entire earth-sheltered wing that included not just bedrooms, but also a root cellar and a workshop space, all maintained at comfortable temperatures by the thermal mass of the surrounding earth. She lived until 1905, dying at the age of 56. Her obituary in the Grand Island newspaper made specific mention of the famous dugout bedroom that had made her a local legend and had inspired dozens of similar constructions throughout the county. Modern earth-sheltered architecture recognizes the principles that Maggie discovered through practical experiment and necessity. The Earth maintains a relatively constant temperature below the frost line, typically between 45 and 55 degrees, depending on the latitude. Structures built into this stable thermal zone require minimal additional heating or cooling to maintain comfortable interior temperatures. Contemporary earth-sheltered homes use the same basic concept that Maggie applied in 1875, though with modern materials and engineering. The principle remains unchanged. When you surround a living space with sufficient thermal mass at a stable temperature, you create an environment that naturally resists the temperature extremes of the outside world. The story is about a widow who refused to accept discomfort as inevitable, who applied scientific principles to solve a practical problem, and who endured mockery and concern from neighbors who couldn't understand what she was trying to achieve. She built something that seemed insane to conventional thinking, but proved to be brilliantly practical through actual results. Because sometimes the most efficient solution is also the most unconventional. Sometimes comfort comes not from burning more fuel, but from working with natural systems rather than against them. Sometimes the person everyone calls crazy is simply seeing possibilities that others are too constrained by convention to recognize. And sometimes a bedroom dug into a hillside proves warmer than any above-ground structure, teaching an entire community that innovation often means questioning assumptions everyone else takes for granted.